Welcome again to New Wine Church, and thanks for joining us here online. You're always welcome to worship with us in person. We meet here in this sanctuary every Sunday at 4 p.m. We're at the foot of Main Street in downtown Newmarket, so Water and Main Street, this is where you'll find us. Well, I want to say welcome to another fall season. I wonder how many of you felt very ready for the fall or school year to begin. And who of us maybe felt a little unprepared for it? Who of us maybe feels just like summer's just like way too short? Somehow for me this year, summer both felt too short and too long, and in some ways busier than the school year. I don't know if you resonate with that, but that's totally where I found myself at the end of August. I was able to catch my breath for like a couple weeks ago, and our family went camping at the shores of Lake Huron, and it was wonderful. But then I came back, rested for sure. I as rested as you can be from sleeping on the ground for a few nights. But when I came back, I just felt like the busyness of life was just waiting there for me, like sitting on the front step of my house. And what's funny about busyness is that it's not just like an object you pick up and remove and it's gone out of your life. Like it lives on our calendar, but it really lives here and here. It's like the hum of anxiety that vibrates in our soul, which at varying frequencies can manifest itself physically. And how many of us can name right off the bat the place in our bodies that stress and anxiety show up? I like to say that I'm a fairly kinetic person. Like I like to move, I need to be active, and I especially like to ride bikes. Mountain bike, road bike, banana seat, beach cruiser, I'll take it all. But for me, riding not only helps me release, but also helps like unfog my brain and free up headspace. And at times, however, biking has become the thing. Like it becomes the only way I cope with stress because, well, it's fun, and I really don't have to talk about anything, if I'm going to be honest. When I've become obsessive about it, it unfortunately stops working, and it plays the wrong role, and it becomes unhealthy for me. I did this once with weightlifting, not that you can tell, but my very first semester of seminary was extremely stressful. Like I just didn't feel ready, I was always behind, I felt like I didn't belong, and I honestly hated it. So like a good 22-year-old struggling with his ego, I went to the weight room on campus. And I went to the weight room and I hit it hard. And like when I saw results, it felt so good. I felt successful at something and I put on like 15 pounds of muscle. The problem, however, was that I still struggled to feel like I belonged. I struggled to feel like I was good enough, and because this coping didn't really change anything about me other than my appearance. It didn't help me actually deal with what I needed to deal with. So when the end of the second semester finally came, I was totally depleted. I was exhausted from the year and I just needed a change. My school was in Chicago, a wonderful city, but I just needed out. I never said that out loud, but Bethany, my now wife, clearly had sensed it. Like I so needed a reset. I needed things to change. I needed to start over. So she called me up and she said, we should apply to work in the Boundary Waters this summer. If you don't know what the Boundary Waters is, it's this gigantic landmass of protected land in northern Minnesota. It borders Canada and it's filled with nothing but lakes and trees and these big bluffs and rocks. The land is so protected there that you are not even allowed to drive a boat with a motor on the lakes. This makes the water clean and like so pristine, in fact, that as you're paddling your canoe across the lake, you could just dip your water bottle into the water and drink straight from the source. When we arrived at the camp, which was on the Gunflint Trail, I kid you not, that is the actual name of the road. We went through 4 weeks of extensive training. And the first 2 weeks of training included general info about the Boundary Waters and how to camp and how to travel safely and how to tie knots, how to hang a bear pack, how to give first aid in the middle of the wilderness, what to do in a thunderstorm, how to navigate with a compass. The next 2 weeks were in the field training. So there were 6 guides and 2 camp directors, and we went out into the wilderness for 2 weeks of camping, paddling, portaging, all of it. And it was really challenging. Even though I had been weightlifting all school year, I was not at all prepared for the kind of demand that canoeing and portaging would have on my body. My muscles quickly became sore from paddling, and my legs were so tired from portaging heavy Duluth packs and canoes. And if you've ever portaged a canoe, you know that you are also not typically walking on a nice, even paved road. You're walking in mud, slippery logs, walking through water. You're going uphill and downhill. The terrain is always challenging. So on top of that, in case you forgot, you're carrying a canoe on your back, which has got to be one of the most awkward things you can carry. They can easily sway front and back, and they're challenging to keep steady, especially as you're walking these difficult trails. So our canoes were Alumacraft, these big aluminum beasts, 17 feet long and like 60 pounds. They were, however, fitted with this yoke across the middle with these like 2 brick-like green pads that rested on your shoulders to carry the canoe. And it was to make it carrying the canoe easier and to steady it, but it did not take away from the challenge of carrying one. I eventually got used to it and better at carrying the canoe in various packs. And eventually my muscles took the hint that they were no longer going to be big, but instead lean and better for endurance. That was my summer, 2007, leading and guiding groups through the wilderness by canoe and portage, cooking over the fire, drinking from the lake, sleeping under the stars, and enjoying a 90°C sauna at the end of each week. It was so good and exactly the kind of reset I needed. I remember running into a friend that summer who asked me, "And it sounds so tiring. Like, are you just exhausted?" And I found myself surprised at his question because although the trips and the work were not easy, it was certainly physically demanding work, I had not felt exhausted. I actually felt rested. I had learned and lived into a different rhythm. Now, my body went through physiological changes too, but my outlook and my attitude were more positive, and I was in touch with my natural circadian rhythm. I ate better, I moved without hurry, and my mind was free, and I felt it. Now, I also learned something very important that summer that I still carry with me to this day. I learned one of my first lessons about what success can actually look and feel like. When I was in school the previous school year, I did not feel successful. So I looked for it and chased it down elsewhere. But where I found myself was in a place that didn't provide any resolve or change me in any healthy way, or in the way that I certainly needed to. I was chasing what theologian and author Richard Foster calls muchness and manyness. Now, these are obviously not real words, but as I said them, I trust you know exactly what they mean. Muchness and manyness are what we most often think we need. The need to have everything, or at least the next thing. It's the path that tells us we're never enough unless we have this, or we're never enough unless we've accomplished that. The same path, unfortunately, disregards our past accomplishments and convinces us that we're either imposters or still not good enough and will never measure up. Muchness and manyness are not just material things. They are simply the things we feel we lack. Things like more affirmation at work or someone else's approval. It can show up when we compare ourselves or our lives to others. Because really it's the feeling we get when we feel like we just don't measure up. This is where vices step in and try to do some patchwork on our insecurities. Muchness and manyness don't actually help us know or find what we really want. They don't help us persevere when things get real and things get tough. They take us on shortcuts and they show us emergency exits. Our desire for muchness and manyness doesn't help us find what we're looking for, nor does it help us feel complete and steady and sure. Some weeks ago, I was put onto a podcast by my neighbor. The podcast is called We Can Do Hard Things. It's hosted by Glennon Doyle. And in this particular episode, she was interviewing Suzanne Stabile, who's an author whose primary work has to do with the Enneagram. It was a fascinating and revealing episode, but what caught my attention was when Suzanne quoted Richard Foster's quote about muchness and manyness. Now, she tweaked it a little, only to add a pretty important piece to it. This is what she said. She said, Richard Foster's quote still rings true, that the adversary, or our biggest distractions in life, majors in three things, and I'm going to add a fourth. She says they are noise, hurry, crowds, and technology. And we'll talk about these things in this series. Says, if he can keep us engaged in muchness and manyness, he will rest satisfied. I think it's safe to say that many of us are distracted, and that we're actually quite good at distracting ourselves. We distract ourselves for many reasons, but I think the two major reasons are because, one, we don't want to deal with how hard things are or feel. And two, because of that, we live in this constant loop of being overwhelmed and distracted and overwhelmed and distracted, and nothing ever changes. The tricky part about that circle is that it's really a downward spiral. But life is hard, right? And that's life. The good, the bad, the challenging, the successes, the failures, the learning, the growth, that's life. But we've become convinced that it can all be easy, or that it at least should be. And when it's not, we dupe ourselves into distractions, and then dopamine hits, and for some of us, excessive dopamine. It's like it's an IV drip, or the morphine button you can press to curb the wave of pain or discomfort when it starts rolling in. We live like we can preserve the good moments and the good feelings, and not only is that impossible, that's not life. This is why I love that we've made the following verse our foundational verse here at New Wine. It's from Matthew 11, 28 through 30, and I particularly love the Message translation, which reads, "Are you tired? Are you worn out and burned out on religion? Come to me and get away with me, and you will recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace, and I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." In the NIV translation, it reads, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, a yoke is not easy or light. A yoke, not a canoe yoke, but a yoke that is made for farms, it's heavy and clunky and built for cattle, not you and me. Even the yoke for a canoe isn't comfortable. But they're not designed for comfort, they are designed for work. They are designed to do something difficult, like plow a field or go on a portage. They're designed to make the work doable and achievable. Now, these verses, I love that they imply both rest and work. It's not all rest and it's not all work. It's both. It's a healthy balance. In the first translation, it reads, walk with me and work with me. It implies that we are not alone, that we're invited to participate with Jesus in the work of relationship with him and with neighbor, the work of God's mission and vision for the world, for the renewing of it, for it to be filled with grace and truth and forgiveness and compassion. Jesus' plan is to show us another way to live, another way to be human, a way to live a life that's full, where you have joy and challenge, failure and grace. Because it's always both. It's never a rescue from all that's difficult. And one of the biggest hurdles to living this way, I believe, is that we have somehow become convinced that it's either unrealistic to live this way, or that we're just not good enough, not holy enough, not spiritual or religious enough to make it happen. But God's grace and invitation doesn't hinge on whether we think we're capable enough or not, thankfully. I had my head in a fantastic book this week. It's called The Divine Embrace. It's written by Robert E. Weber. And there are two major takeaways that landed for me when thinking about muchness and manyness and reliving times in my life where I felt I couldn't measure up. First, he talked about having a more stable spiritual life. And at first read, it might sound like he's encouraging us to just bear down and work harder and be better, especially when it comes to living out and into a spirituality. And here's how he describes a stable spiritual life. The monastic concept of stability translated into our spiritual life means stay in your baptism and continue to live out of the death and resurrection of Jesus by continually dying to sin and rising to the new life of the Spirit, staying in God's divine embrace. In the business and corporate world, success is always up. It's always like linear if it's not exponential, and at least that's how we like to see it. But living into your baptism is a circle. Living into failure, dying to ourselves, only to then live into our resurrection with Jesus, which is what reminds us. He reminds us that there is life. Now these circles, instead of downward spirals, they are upward spirals. It's fitting this week that we had a baptism here in our church. It's such a good reminder, this sacrament, this good and holy thing that reminds us and invites us not into perfection, but to live into the reality of our failures, to die to what's not life-giving in our lives, and not just not life-giving, but the things and habits and mentalities we have that actually diminish who we are and how we're meant to live. It's also a reminder not to stay in the sackcloth and ashes of our worst moments, to stop beating ourselves up and just live into the resurrection that Jesus promises, which isn't about just an afterlife. This is an invitation for this life. And the second thing he writes that had landed so refreshingly gently on my heart this week names the issue of holiness and the ridiculous pursuit of perfection we continue to face. He says we put spirituality or faith in something other than God's embrace. First, we put spirituality in ourselves, not God's divine embrace. And then we feel responsible to nourish our own spirituality. We apply the word nourish to ourselves in the way that it's commonly used, the care of the self or self-care. That we nourish our bodies well by eating well, sleeping well, exercise, reading books, engaging in good conversation, and opening ourselves to new ideas. He says, so it's natural for us to think that we approach the nourishing of our spirituality in the same way. We ask, what should I do to nourish my spiritual life? And then we're told, do this and do that, and you'll be spiritual. The point is, of course, he says, that we are made to feel responsible then for our own spiritual growth. That what we do is of most importance. The message is that the time and energy we give these disciplines and others will then determine our spiritual condition. So he closes by saying, I'm asking you to see Christian nourishment in a different way. Now, when we put spirituality in God's embrace, the church and its worship are seen as sources that nourish this spiritual life, not by what the church and its worship demand of us, but by what they reveal. The church and its worship are sources of nourishment because they embody God's story and witness to God's divine embrace. And they constantly keep God's vision of a restored people and a renewed earth before us. I don't know how each of you showed up here, where you find yourself, and where you are in terms of needing a reset in your life. And I want to encourage you to name for yourself the places in your life where you feel like you're chasing muchness and manyness, and to name what paths they've also put you on. And I want to remind you that God's embrace and love for you, God's love and embrace for you is simply because this is a fulfilling place to live from. It's a place that reminds us where God is enough. It's a place where we can live more fully into the reality and the rhythm of rest and work. I'll share this verse one last time as we close. Are you tired, worn out, and burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you will learn to live freely and lightly. God bless.
At 29 and I find myself wondering what did happen to the last 10. I ran away with my life, fast forward, never turn back again. It's kind of funny that the more we pass time, the more we need to set the ring